Guest speaker today is Dr. Richard Leblanc. He is an award-winning teacher and researcher, consultant, lawyer, and specialist on corporate governance and accountability. He's a fellow of the Institute of Certified Management Consultants of Ontario and was recently named an academic fellow with the International CMC Institute. Dr. Leblanc's research is expertise in corporate governance, specifically in the effectiveness of boards of directors. Dr. Leblanc is editor of the Handbook of Board Governance, a comprehensive guide for public, private, and not-for-profit board members. He also has worldwide sales for his book, Inside the Boardroom. His work directly or indirectly has impacted companies throughout the world, including those that have used Dr. Leblanc's methodology to strengthen their governance effectiveness and accountability practices. Please welcome Dr. Richard Leblanc. How are you?
Thanks very much, Craig, for the very nice introduction. And also thank you to Sandra for the great efforts at facilitation and coordination. We have a large group of CMCs today. I'm a CMC and I've been a CMC for, I guess, over 20 years. And I also have a PhD in corporate governance and I consult to boards. And it's always struck me how few people consult to boards. I think in Canada, there's probably a dozen people. So I thought it would be very interesting for CMCs to give a bit of a one-on-one session on consulting and serving on boards, to be able to prompt you in that direction, because it could be a revenue stream for you, both to serve on a board and also to advise a board. This is my handbook that came out last year. The Handbook of Board Governance, 2nd edition, and I think Sandra will put in the chat the Amazon link. So governance as a field has changed significantly. These are some of the excuses I get from my client boards, and I'm not going to read them, but there's not an excuse I haven't heard. In fact, I shouldn't say that. I heard 2 weeks ago, Dr. Leblanc is anti-management, ANTI-management. And that brings up an interesting point. You cannot, in my view, advise both management and the board. So I'm a management consultant, but I've never consulted to management. I've always consulted to the board. So as a consultant, it's sort of like if you're a real estate lawyer and someone comes into your office and says, I want to sell a property, and someone else comes in and says, I want to buy a property. Can you simultaneously advise both parties? And the answer is no, because they have capacity for adverse interests. So it's not possible, in my view, to serve the board and to management. You sort of have to pick one. If you're advising the board, you should be free to give a recommendation that management doesn't like. So I'm very clear at the beginning of all my engagements, and I probably over lifetime, I probably advised over 150 boards. I'm clear right from day one that I'm not there to be accountable to the CEO or to the management team. My client is the board, and more specifically, my client is not the chair of the board, because if there's a problem with the board, there's a problem with the chair. My client is the governance committee. A board normally has committees, and the three popular committees are the audit committee, the governance committee, and the compensation committee. The governance committee is responsible for recruiting directors, the governance and nominating committee, evaluating them and recommending to the board committee composition and board composition. So my client almost always is the governance committee. So it's important at the outset to any governance engagement to establish with your client what the accountabilities are, because you can get into trouble if management mistakenly believes that you're there to serve them. You might work with management, but you're accountable to the board if you're doing governance consulting. So what have I learned over the last 25 years is it comes down to the board. And this is very simple, right? The number one job of the board is to hire and fire and pay the CEO. So regulators and activist investors, and I also advise activist investors, they look at the board, because if you want to replace the management team, you target the board, because the management team is always accountable to the board. So much of the regulation and focus in the last 25 years has been focused on corporate directors, because they are the ones with the authority and they are the ones with the power. So regulators have seen fit to saddle boards, if you will, with significant regulation, particularly if you're a publicly traded company, and also if you're a financial institution, a credit union, a bank, or an insurance company. But not-for-profit organizations and charities, and there are many people on this call that advise those clients as well, as do I, and crown corporations. They all have boards of directors. In fact, I don't think there's a single entity I know of that doesn't have a board of directors. So to some extent or another, the emphasis right now is on boards. So what I'm going to address for the next maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And by the way, if you have any questions at all, please put them, as Craig said, in the chat. I think the questions are starting to come. So what am I going to address? I'm going to talk about responsibilities of boards, consulting to boards, and then I'm going to make a bit of a pivot to talk about serving on boards. It's always struck me that lawyers and accountants, when they serve on boards, are very narrow, and management consultants are not. Management consultants, there's an opportunity, I believe, for management consultants, given the nature of our work, to serve on boards. And many consultants aren't even aware that there can be a process to make yourself known to boards, and we're going to walk through how that process looks. And I'm going to give you pointers that I've given to other prospective directors as well. So I'll talk about being invited onto boards, questions to ask before joining a board. I want to make this as practical as I can. So to begin with, what is the job of a board? What is the number one job? And it's right here: to hire, fire, and pay the CEO. That's it. You can get everything else I'm saying today wrong, but if you're a board of directors and you get that right, you're gold. You can get everything else I'm saying today right, but if you don't get this right, you're dead. It is your number one job as a board. And the surveys suggest that it's the poorest done. Interesting. It's the number one job, and survey after survey, it's the worst thing boards do. Now, there's a reason for that, and chiefly among them is that the incumbent CEO doesn't want to put it on the agenda. Stanford University suggests that the average board spends 2 hours a year on selecting its next CEO succession planning. Every board should have an emergency CEO succession plan and a permanent CEO succession plan that should be approved in writing by the board. Next is your fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty and duty of care. I'll do fiduciary first. Fiduciary duty means to act, and it changed in Canada last year. It used to be to act with a view to the best interests of the corporation. Now it has changed as follows: to act with a view to the best long-term and short-term interests of the corporation, including the following stakeholders. And the legislation goes on to enumerate the stakeholders, including employees, pensioners, the environment, local communities, suppliers, customers. So our law in Canada has changed significantly, because now directors have to talk about the long term, and they have to talk about interests, stakeholder interests. So you could, for example, be on a board of directors, and I predict that this will happen, and you could not give adequate consideration to the environment, let's say climate change or the path to net zero, and plaintiffs' attorneys can sue you. And one thing about serving on a board, by the way, is when the company's sued, you're sued. So you should have a director and officer insurance policy that includes advancement of legal fees and includes an indemnity. So fiduciary duty has changed in Canada to include a broader set of stakeholders. The duty of care is to act as a reasonably prudent person would act in similar circumstances. That means that you're engaged, your cameras are on, your microphone works, you've prepared for the meeting, the average directorship now is 278 hours a year. And this is not for-profit or not-for-profit. This is all types of directorships. And just because you're on a not-for-profit board doesn't mean you have to prepare less. The fiduciary duty and the duty of care apply. Judges don't distinguish whether you're on a not-for-profit board or the type of board that you're on. Your fiduciary duty and your duty of care applies. It includes reading the information packages. It includes making a contribution. It includes asking questions. And the other role of a board is selecting an independent chair. By far, the majority, I'd say 90 to 95% of all Canadian companies, probably closer to 95, have a completely independent chair. That means a chair that is not related to management or to a significant shareholder. Someone from the outside. And watch, by the way, social relationships, backgrounds. Like the activist investors and regulators will look into how you came to be on the board. And if you're a friend with a member of management, or you're a member of a pre-existing social group or club, that is asking for trouble, because that's an interlock. So independent means socially and relationally independent as well. So regulators tend to be looking at four things: independence, competency, behavior, and diversity, in that order. They want independent directors. Competency means a competency matrix. The majority of boards have this. They've got a matrix of the competencies that are needed and which directors possess which competencies. Good boards now have behaviors as well. You know, I usually say to boards, and I'm not going to say this here, I say, put up your hand if there's an asshole on your board. Sorry for swearing. And about 90% of the hands go up. And I say to the 10% of the hands that don't go up, guess what? If you don't know who the asshole is, you're the asshole. So on every board I've assessed, there's always been at least one person that was not quite right in terms of behavior. And this includes communication style, teamwork, influence, getting along well with others, asking a question in a certain way, being collegial. That is very important. And if you have a director on a board that is not quite right, as I say it, it can really wreck a board. So recruiting directors should focus on all four of these: independence, competency, behavior, and diversity. I want to make a comment about diversity. The academic evidence is that diverse boards make better decisions. They mitigate groupthink. Diversity in all of its forms. I'm seeing matrices now that include gender, gender identity, Indigenous peoples, racialized individuals, age, and geography. Those tend to be the touch points for diversity. If you have a homogeneous board, the odds are that you're going to have interlocks and you're going to have groupthink. Groupthink is premature agreement because of social ties, but you might be making a very wrong decision. So regulators now all over the world are focusing on these four things: independence, competency, behavior, and diversity. The strategic role of the board is to approve the strategic plan of the company, including the key performance indicators and the value drivers of the business model to measure the achievement of the strategy. Financial literacy, controls, and assurance. Now, not all management consultants are financially literate. I am not. I'm a management consultant. I'm a lawyer. I'm a governance expert. I took a finance course in my MBA 25 years ago. Now, if I were invited onto a board, I would absolutely acquire financial literacy. So it is okay, and I use myself as an example, it is okay not to be financially literate. It is not okay to stay that way once you serve on a board. And you cannot be financially literate by taking a course, such as the Directors College or the Institute for Corporate Directors. A 4-weekend course with a module on financial literacy won't make you financially literate. Financially literate can be acquired through concentrated expertise and the investment of hours. In my view, it's at least 75 hours. And I've recommended replacing directors on boards that were not financially literate. So if there's one literacy that you should have as a management consultant, it's financial literacy. So if you're contemplating serving on a board, contemplate acquiring financial literacy if you don't already possess it. Lastly is risk governance and tone at the top. Tone at the top, and I don't mean this is not a hierarchy just because I'm mentioning it last. It's actually the most important, is ethics and conduct. and what is acceptable. And the regret, and I've probably interviewed over 1,000 directors. I ask a question: what's your greatest regret? And guess what it is? Well, there's two. Number one is I didn't fire the CEO sooner. The second regret of directors is I didn't speak up. The behavior that you observe, the behavior that you read, the behavior that you see and hear is the behavior that you have accepted as a director. So not speaking up can absolutely be catastrophic to a company, especially if you have a nagging ethical doubt in the back of your mind. Speak up. Put your hand up in a boardroom and speak up. I guarantee you, if you have a question or a concern, half the board has the same concern. And we now have laws that are changing to permit speaking up. We have in-camera sessions, which means management leaves the room and it's only the individual independent directors that are in the room. And now that's the law in Canada, is a mandatory in-camera session of a board every meeting. And the in-camera sessions are now going to the committees as well. And also governance, risk governance. The vast majority of risks, including Russian state actors and state-supported cyber terrorists, operational risk, reputational risk, employee health and safety risk, ESG risk. These are all non-financial risks. 75% of the value of a company now is non-financial. The leading indicators, they, in my view, tend to be the least mature. So when I go into a board to assess the board, I'm looking at the non-financial as well as the financial. By the time it gets to a lagging indicator, it's too late. So customer satisfaction, data, digital, community impact, the environment, sustainability, these are crucial. These are crucial to be measured, and they're crucial to have the risks identified, including the internal controls. So what regulators want is three things from a board. Approve the risks, approve the controls to mitigate each risk, and independent assurance that the controls are working. Management is not independent. The only people who can provide assurance that the controls are working are three people: risk, compliance, and internal audit. Those functions should be independent of senior and operating management. So risk governance is crucial. It's absolutely crucial, as is shown at the top. Now let's shift gears to talk about consulting to boards of directors. As I said, establish your client and accountability. It is inappropriate, if not dangerous, to be consulting to both management and the board. You have to pick one, and regulations are heading in this direction. Is we want independent advisors advising the board. So if you happen to advise management of a particular company, you should not be advising the board. If you seek to advise the board of a particular company, then you should not have advised management. Okay, so keep independent from the management team. Your client, as I said earlier, is the governance committee. It's not the board chair. Be independent from management. In mind, capacity for adverse interests. Absolutely, there's a capacity for adverse interests for the management team. The board is not there to support the management team. The board is there to oversee the performance of the management team. So what I usually say to the management team, and it tends to be the corporate secretary, the general counsel, and the CEO, is I work with you, but I work for the board. My reporting relationship is to the governance committee and the board of directors. I also use advance retainers. Advance retainers means that I get paid a certain amount of money up front and I exhaust that retainer, then I get paid again. So I never have my advice tied to pay. So it preserves my independence by getting paid in advance. So that's what pay is. It's a simple contract. And I've been doing for 25 years, I've been getting advanced retainers because I don't want to be owed money from a client and then having to advise that client. I want to be paid prior to delivering my advice because it preserves my independence of mind and also the perception for independence. So consulting to a board, it helps because a board is different. I liken a board to triangle is the management, and I liken the board to a piece of wood on top of a triangle. So in other words, when you're consulting to management, you might be consulting for one person, right? It's the person that happens to be in that triangle, and the CEO is at the top, so it might even be the CEO. But with a board, it's flat. So you're advising a number of directors. You're advising an entity, all of which have equal power. Even the chair of the board is a peer among equals. So it's a different beast when you're advising a board as opposed to a management team. And also, and you all know this, a proper methodology, which is how you're collecting your data. I use 4 sources. I use documents, I use interviews, I use observation, and I use a survey. Okay, a survey, observation. Observation means I will look at a board in real time, including virtually, right? I will be part of the meeting and I will observe the give and take. So interviews, observation, documents. I've now forgotten the 4. Interviews, observation, documents, and a survey. And then you get your data, your findings, and then you make recommendations based on your data. And I look for, and I don't have to tell all of you this, you do this. I look for shared consensus. I look for areas where there happens to be a majority of the board thinking a certain way. And then with my professional expertise, I'm able to move where the client is and move the client forward based on best practices, based on regulation. Okay, 3 out of 5. It's going well. Let's talk now about what makes for a good and poor director. Independence of mind and not conflict seeking. So you have a responsibility, and much of the litigation involving governance is right here. The 2 words that I circled. That's where most of the fireworks occur. You have an obligation as a director, and I'm going to say this slowly, and you should write it down if you want, to structure your affairs to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest. You have an obligation as a director to structure your affairs to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest. Now, most directors do that. The ones that don't, mentally, are not able to be a director because they're so focused on what's in it for me. They use the board as an opportunity to solicit business. They cannot, their mindset is not, they don't belong on a board. They belong as a supplier, a customer, a shareholder, all of whom can be self-interested. A board, a director, and by the way, it's joint and several liability. So if you have another director, if you're on a board and another director is conflict seeking, your assets and reputation can be put at risk because regulators rely on all of you to self-police. So at a minimum, you should have a robust conflict of interest policy. And just because a director has a conflict of interest, it doesn't mean that that's a bad director. It just means that the conflict has to be managed. And normally you do that by full disclosure of the conflict. And it could be you, it could be a family member, or it could be an entity with an affiliate that you have an interest in. You put up your hand, you disclose, and that could mean disclosing in writing. You leave the room. You have to leave the room, and you recuse yourself from voting. Now, the board, in its deliberations, may decide that it wants to pursue the transaction. That's fine, but you play no part in that. You have recused. From time to time, you will have a conflict of interest, you recuse. Now, that's different from conflict seeking. Conflict seeking is you'll do the opposite. You'll structure your affairs to pursue corporate opportunities when you're on a board. So when you serve on a board, you're taking a lot of opportunities out of your professional practice. You're resting everything, and your sole purpose is to fulfill your fiduciary duty and your duty of care. I spend a lot of time on this, and that's because it's crucially important. This is the one that will bite you. Competencies and keeping current. Solidarity. What I mean here is when the board has made a decision, and let's say it's not consensual, let's say it's 8-2 or 7-3 or 9-1. Your obligation as a director is to support that board decision. If you cannot, you have to stand down from the board. Okay, and this is the hardest thing to do is you've disagreed with a decision, but you have to support it. So solidarity and resiliency in reestablishing healthy boardroom dynamics is crucial. Confidentiality. You know, what happens in a boardroom stays in a boardroom. It doesn't land on Twitter. It doesn't land in press releases. It doesn't land in elevator conversations. It doesn't go to anybody. If you're on a board and a stakeholder approaches you and says, what happened during the meeting, you cannot have that discussion. Okay, it's a breach of confidentiality. There's a reason that confidentiality exists, but and one director leaking information can absolutely wreck a board dynamic. Asking effective questions, that's the job of directors. I look at 5 or 6 things. I look at frequency of questions. First of all, let me back up a second. You know, people say there are no stupid questions. There are absolutely stupid questions. If your chair of the board says that's a good question, it means it's a stupid question. Okay? Don't ask stupid questions. Don't ask questions that are in the materials. Don't ask technical compliance questions. Ask strategic questions. And chances are, if you're independent, you're not from the sector. So you've got to put in even more time in your first 2 or 3 years to understand the strategy, the business model. Okay, to be able to advise people and ask questions that have been in the industry for the last 30 or 40 years. So it's really hard to ask good questions. I look at frequency. I look at duration. If you're asking a question that's over 2 minutes, you're not asking a question, you're giving a speech. I look at the words that are used. I look at tone. I look at body language. I look at all of that. I even break questions down, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, etc. So asking a question can be learned. It is a learned behavior, but the job of a board is to ask questions. The job of management is to answer questions. Maintaining an oversight role, not an operational role. Now, management may tell you that everything is operational. Management wants you in the sky, right? So once you have your strategic plan and your key performance indicators, any question up to that level is totally acceptable, and everybody's on the same page. So whether a question is a governance question or an operational question, it's premature to make that determination unless and until you have a strategic plan that can be measured. Preparing effectively for meetings, collegial relationships, use of technology. Every director now on my client boards, I advise cameras on, fully engaged. You can use a blurred background if you're concerned with privacy. And I do this with my instructors at the university as well, is cameras on. And by camera, I don't mean a camera inside your laptop. And for heaven's sakes, don't use devices for client communications or board meetings. Get yourself a proper laptop with an additional monitor, but ideally a desktop, especially during the pandemic. And I tell my clients, your computer is more important than your car. Your car should be sitting in your driveway. So a decent microphone, a Logitech camera, high-speed internet. And, you know, we're not going back to all in-person meetings. Like post-COVID, it's going to be a hybrid. It's going to be, I predict, 40, 50% virtual and 50, 60% in person. So it's crucial that you have a home office set up. And the cyber crime is mistakes. It's working from home, including directors and management, and your internal controls, and your guard is down. If you're borrowing devices from family members, I mean, there's a whole slew of internal controls to battle Russian hacking. So use your technology wisely, and don't scrimp when it comes to technology, including proper lighting. So lighting, high-speed internet, microphone, and camera are all crucial. Okay, so let's assume now you've been invited to serve on a board. Okay, people know you, people know your profile. They've brought you. They've invited you. Normally, it's not would you like to serve. It's would you like to come for an interview. But there's even a step before that. Is your bio and your resume get you the interview. It's like I tell my undergraduate students or my graduate students is your resume will get you the interview gets you the job. And the job is not after your first board. Choose your first board very wisely. If in doubt, say no, especially when it comes to ethical concerns. Some of the best decisions in life is no. If there's not a fit or there's concern with ethics or performance of the company or performance of the management, it's better to say no. Normally, in your board trajectory, your first 2 or 3 boards will be not-for-profit. And by not-for-profit, I mean hospital, college, university, charity, association, okay? Those types of entities all have boards. Choose wisely your first board, because your reputation as a director is established on your first board. And people in Canada know one another. When they do reference checks, it's not 6 degrees of separation in Canada. It's more like 3, right? So be very careful and choose your first board based on logic, passion, interest, etc., and make a rational, informed choice. Now, before you get to the interview, a cover letter, a resume. I want to say something about director resumes. You know, use proper font. Use 12-point or 14-point font. People you're reading your resume are in their 50s and 60s, right? So getting cute with script and 8-point font. And by the way, people say that a resume should be 2 pages. Not at all. A resume should be fulsome, but a board resume is different. A management resume is hierarchical. I did this, 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 and this, and here are the timeframes. A board resume begins with your competencies, because the matrix that they're using is a competency matrix. So you begin with your competencies and attributes. What competencies and attributes do you excel at? Don't pick 10, pick 5. There are certain competencies that you are excellent at. Then associate each competency and attribute with a couple of lines on the results that you've obtained to validate that you possess that competency. And include integrity. Include integrity, because it's the unanswered question if you possess, and I hope that everybody possesses integrity, but not everybody does, right? So include a description that would lead a third-party viewer of your resume to infer that you possess integrity. So you're listing your competencies and your attributes, then you list the various organizations that you are affiliated with, that you belong to, any past work that would lend it to board service. Prepare for the interview. So now the board, the governance and nominating committee rather, is impressed with your background, and they bring you in for an interview. I have a rule of thumb. When I go on television, every 1 minute, and it may not seem like this, but it is, every 1 minute is an hour of preparation. So if I'm being interviewed for 4 minutes, I've done 4 hours of preparation. And I've advised directors the same thing. If you're having a 1-hour interview, you should know more about the company than the board, or you should know as much as the management team. So you should put in, now you may not do this, but if you really want the position, put in 30 or 40 hours for the 1-hour interview. You cannot over prepare for an interview. Put the time in. Background and reference checks. And I'm now starting to see personality tests for some boards to determine whether there's a fit. That's not widespread, but I'm seeing it. So your reference checks and your background checks. And if you're on the other end and you're recruiting someone, be sure to do background and reference checks. I tell boards, if you don't know the faults of a person, you're not doing your homework, because every person has faults. So go on LinkedIn, find out first, second level connections, and call people and just say, what's this person? Call people that I'm now talking about the board. Call, if you're recruiting a director, call individuals that you know that are on a board with that director and say, what's that person's contribution like, right? So do the reference checks. Movement to diversifying boards, quotas and term limits. With term limits, I mentioned diversity. I want to mention term limits. Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, United Kingdom, India, Australia, they're all moving to 9 years. Canada is probably going to move to 9 years. 9 years, and then you're not independent anymore. So it's not a lifetime appointment. So we're seeing, I'd say offhand, about 30 to 40% of boards now have term limits, ranging from 9 to 12 years. Lawyers, accountants, and consultants, once you get on the board, and this includes CMCs, you're not there as a lawyer. I'll pick on lawyers. I won't pick on CMCs. I've got too much respect for CMCs. Actually, I'm going to make a lawyer joke. I say that my wife is a lawyer. I say, lawyers marry lawyers because no one else wants to live with them. It's a joke. I hope there's not lawyers on the call, but lawyers, accountants, and consultants, you are not practicing law when you're on a board. That can be hired. You're overseeing. You're overseeing the strategy, the risks, the performance of management. So Professionals, lawyers, accountants, consultants, in no particular order, they tend to make mistakes on their first couple of boards because they default into their profession, right? I'm here to advise. You're not here to advise. Management has their advisors, right? You're not here to meet with management. You're not here to employ your technology expertise to the CIO. I'm giving an example that happened last week in one of my board reviews. That is too close to management. You are here to oversee. You're not here to practice as a consultant or an accountant or a lawyer. So it's almost like you have to turn your professional hat off when you begin to serve on a board. Your focus should be knowledge of the industry, the business, and strategy. That's your focus. And that's hard for lawyers. It's hard for accountants. It's probably less hard for consultants, because my sense is that consultants are a little more grounded and broader than legal and accounting. Legal and accounting is very narrow. So it's the transition from management consultant to director is probably easier for CMCs given the nature of what you all do. How directors are compensated for board service. Ask about money. And put it on the table. How much is the directorship paid, and how are the fees? Normally, if it's a for-profit board, you're going to get some portion of shares. If it's a very new board, you might get share options. You'll get some portion in cash. Normally, it's 50% cash, 50% equity. If it's a for-profit and a listed or mature board. And the fees may range from 25 to 50,000 for a small board, up to 75, 100, 150 for a more mature board. If it is a not-for-profit, on the other hand, you may not be remunerated. Some not-for-profits are remunerating their directors because they see that it's a value add, and it's not a huge amount; it's a modest amount. And in the middle, it's state-owned enterprises, crown corporations. If you're sitting, for example, Ontario has 500 agencies, boards, commissions, and tribunals. Same with the federal government, right? So there you have a modest stipend. But ask about compensation. Put it on the table because you want to know, right? People want performance, but don't leave pay out of the question. Okay. Lastly, questions, and then we'll turn it over to Craig for questions. Questions to ask. Now, when you're asked to serve on a board, okay, so you've gone through the resume, you've gone through the interview, and they say, we would like you to serve on the board. Do not say yes, okay? Is ask for certain things first. What are my roles, responsibilities, obligations, and time? And these will probably come out in the interview. Do your own background checks of the company, and you can do that. I do the first name fraud, or the last name of all the executives. And I do this before I even accept a client, by the way. I do this for all the directors, all the executives. I do reputation checks. I do fraud, complaint, litigation associated with each person's name. And I've rejected clients that have had legal or reputational issues. So because of joint and several liability, do checks, do your own checks of the company. Offer to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that you can get access to information, strategy, financial reporting, tax, particularly if you're serving for a not-for-profit. Your assets are on the line when it comes to tax remittances, including HST and employees. Copy of director and officer entity insurance, including indemnity and the advancement of legal fees. And ask for the true copy and read it and make sure that you're covered in a worst case scenario. Assume the worst that could happen and that you're sued. You don't want to be putting your personal assets at risk. Auditors and legal, any reports from an outside legal firm or outside auditors, I would want to see that. Committee books and records, asked to see this as well. And just tell the directors, I want to make an informed decision, right? This is standard operating procedure for me. Lastly, the strategic plan and risk appetite framework. You should see that. Any related party transactions between officers and directors and the company. Be prepared to say no. It is the worst, when you don't do your diligence, you get onto the board and you realize this is not for me. Your liability continues even if you resign from the board. So with your due diligence, you'll be in an informed position to say no. And I'm not suggesting that you say no, but some of the mistakes I've seen from directors is they were too eager to serve on a board. They liked being flattered and they really didn't do their due diligence. Get independent advice when necessary and be prepared to put in the time. If you have a professional practice and a board directorship is 300 hours and you're working 2,500 hours a year, this is about 10% of your practice time. So there's an opportunity cost here for you as well. And new directors have also asked to observe meetings so you can see how the board works. Okay, that's a lot in a very short period of time. So let me sit back now. Craig is going to step in and moderate, and we've got a lot of questions, far too many that I've kept track of. So Craig, why don't you fire 5, 7, 8 questions at me, and I'll answer as succinctly as I can. In fact, I'll stop sharing just so we can see a little bit of everybody. Okay, go ahead, Craig.
Richard, first of all, that was really great. Fantastic.
My pleasure.
Very engaging. Appreciate the delivery as well. And I learned one thing. If they ask that funny question, I'm putting my hand up in the meeting. But lots of questions, over 13 here to go through. And I'm starting with Yasmin has said, what are your thoughts on what's happening at Rogers? The majority of the board wanted the CEO to stay. How do you manage this type of conflict?
Well, Rogers is a unique situation because you've got a control trust board with 97% shares, and it's basically Edward Rogers' way or the highway, and you've got dual class shares. So Edward Rogers wanted to replace the CEO, and the board did not let him, and he turned his attention to independent directors. He was successful as of Friday of last week in a court case in British Columbia in replacing 5 independent directors. So Edward Rogers is very unique because it's a dual class share board. It's a control trust. It's anomalous. It's not unique. It's poor governance because the chair of the Rogers board is not independent. The committees are not fully independent, and there's too many insiders and family members on the Rogers board. But the underpinning of it is dual class shares and the control trust. But I wouldn't put Rogers forward, at least at this point in time, for exemplary governance. So those are my quick thoughts. Craig.
I would tend to think that there's probably several other boards around the world that have a lot of those
qualities, yes,
inbred situations.
Yeah, particularly family boards in Canada.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's the most trickiest or most awkward or weird ethical situation you've seen regarding board governance or heard about?
I've seen everything. There's nothing I haven't seen. I've seen sexual misconduct. I've seen fraud. I've seen mismanagement. I've seen tax avoidance. I've seen directors sleeping at meeting. I've seen fist fights. I've seen chairs flown across the room. I mean, these are all exceptional circumstances. The majority of the boards are honest, hardworking, but you do see boards along the edges, Craig, that are highly toxic, and it tends to start behaviorally with a slippery slope. I tell directors, if you're an 8 or a 9 out of 10, you could very easily become a 4 or a 5 in 6 to 12 months if you drop your guard. So what happens is you bring on a director, and the qualities, the behaviors aren't there, and you think that it's going to get better, and it actually gets worse. So as a board, you should really think long and hard about recruitment, and when you see something that you're not comfortable with, speak up sooner rather than later, and have behavioral remediation, because it can very easily get out of hand. And bullies tend to push and push and push. So it's not easy. The problems with boards are behavioral, Craig.
Yeah. Well, I think the bully one's probably a huge one. What about the difference between consulting to management versus consulting to the board? You talked a little bit about that right in your opening remarks. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, there's some firms like consulting, compensation consultants, and even auditors. They will argue that we can do both. We can some partners can consult to the board, and some partners can consult to management. And I don't buy that. And the United Kingdom doesn't. In fact, the United Kingdom has said in the next year, the big four has to literally saw them in half. And the ones that want to consult are a completely separate entity. They're not even in the same office. They're not on the same floor. And the ones that want to audit, which is like governance, right? So you have to pick. You have to, and I know some consultants will argue that I can do both. I can maintain my independence. I'm a purist about this. And there are compensation consultants and auditors that are pure. They say, Richard, we will do one or the other. We will not try to double dip. So I'm not suggesting that you can't double dip. You can't advise both. But if something goes wrong, you're going to have someone on the outside saying, why were you consulting to both the board and management? So the only thing I'm saying is to the management consultants on the call is be aware of this. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but if you're going to do it, have the internal controls and procedures in place that you can do it. And there are some firms that do both.
Yeah, and I guess with larger firms, you might cross that bridge a little more often, and separating and being transparent about those situations probably critical.
Yeah.
From Francois, how does screening for behavior ensure some level of respect for the 10th man principle? Contrarian thinking and behavior may be confused for one.
Yeah, I think Francois' question is the answer to Francois' question is to disagree, but not be disagreeable. And that's a fine line. It's all in the way that you do it, right? Like there's a way. Do you remember that movie Columbo, the detective, right? Like there's a way to ask a hard question in a very soft, curious way. Like, I don't understand. Like if you're a devil's advocate and you're gotcha, the director's call, which means you're leaning forward, right? You're intimidating. You're aggressive. You're asking 2, 3, 4 questions in one question. Then you're rebutting. Your point might be very good, but there's so much behavioral noise that people can't see your point but for your noise. So to Francois, you can be a devil's advocate as long as you address the how, the smoothness. Like you can ask a lethal question in a very nice way, like your tone, your language, your body. I mean, it's an art. It really is, right? So if you want to be that devil's advocate, make sure that the how part is addressed. Otherwise, your days will be numbered.
Can you give us an example?
I had one recently where the person kept leaning in and was making other people feel uncomfortable. And I had a debriefing. I mean, we did a peer review. A peer means you assess one another. And there was the board, and then there was this person. Like the board was 3.5 to 5, and this person was like a 2 point something. So my responsibility was to coach this person. And the person said, Richard, I know I'm an asshole. I'm not going to change. It's just the way I am. And I said, well, let's call him Bill. I said, well, Bill, if you know you're like this and you're having a disruptive effect and you're not willing to modify your behavior, like all behavior is modifiable, right? I mean, let's be serious. So I said, I'm going to recommend that you not continue on the board because you're a disruptive influence. And so I've had to do this about 20 times in the last 5 years, and it's not pleasant. I call it the real nice conversation. It's been real, it's been nice, but it hasn't been real nice. So if you're having a disruptive influence on the board and you're not willing to change, life's too short. And I usually tell the director, listen, you don't have to continue to serve if you're making your own life difficult and everybody else's life difficult. So having the mature confidence, and I also tell the directors to give this person an honorable exit. Don't shame this person. Give this person, if you have to, a retirement dinner or some sort of sweetener so that this person can step down with dignity. And it's no fault. It's like a husband and wife in a divorce, right? Or any two individuals. It doesn't mean you're right and the board's wrong. It just means that it didn't work. So it's not about blame. It's about moving on. Craig.
Great example, thank you. I'm still struck by when you phrased the question and the answer in how can you disagree but not be disagreeable.
Yeah.
So It is an art, and I guess, you know, there's lots of techniques that people have for doing that. Certainly remaining polite and not being too overbearing might be one of a couple of them. But sometimes you got to get your point across. So hey, Anne McTaggart always has some good questions. Can you provide information and context to the board and then leave the room?
Can you repeat that one more time? Can you provide information and context to a board and then leave the room?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
tied with the recuse situation, maybe.
Yeah, like I usually give the board an opportunity to talk without me. So if I'm advising the board, I propose at the end of my session an in-camera session.
Right.
Because I have enough. I think this is what Anne is at. If I'm understanding correctly, is that can you leave the room as a consultant? Yes, you should. You should, because you have an effect on the board. And you want the board, maybe Anne might want to weigh in. Anne, am I understanding your question?
Actually, it was in the context of you have a conflict of interest.
As a consultant?
As a director.
As a director.
Yes. So yes. You've got a whole lot of information, but you're in a conflict situation. You're going to have to leave the room and recuse yourself. But can you impart your knowledge or anything into the subject before you?
Yes, what Anne is saying, and I missed that, Anne. Anne is saying, with a conflict, and I'm going to rephrase it, with a conflict comes knowledge. And are you allowed as a director to impart that knowledge in 3 or 4 minutes and that context before you leave the room? Absolutely, Anne. And I missed that earlier, Anne, so thank you. Yes, yes, yes.
So here's another question dealing with diversity, a really great point that you made earlier on. With your experience on boards and diversity, you know, for example, 50% of the population, you know, 50-50 women, but only 10% of women are represented on corporate boards. How do you see this as being a problem with some of those boards' decisions or you know, just going forward from there? How do they solve that? Maybe
regulators, and it's now reaching North America, NASDAQ, California, and New Jersey. And Trudeau has a minority government, but he has said, his minister has said that quotas will be on the table because the progress is too slow. What we have in non-quota countries, which would be Canada, is we are holding, we meaning regulators, are holding boards responsible for setting their own objectives. For diversification, and that is not getting a lot of traction. The evidence is that the needle is moving very slowly, and it will take a generational change. And it becomes a talent flight as well. You've got this is the sad part, Craig, more qualified women that are sidelined, that are being blocked by individual directors, and they tend to be men. The statistics support this, that want to continue and don't want to stand down. And a board is of a fixed size. The optimal size of a board is 7 to 11. So if and these are conflicted directors, because if you're over tenured, like 9, 10, 11 years, and you are selfishly remaining on a board and not creating room for diversification, I predict that, and it's already starting in the US, it's already starting in NASDAQ. They are imposing quotas, which means you must. And regulators are very permissive. And somewhat passive too, is please do this. And then you get inaction for 5 or 10 years, and then the regulator says, please do it, and they still don't do it. And then regulators in North America are beginning to say, okay, if you don't do it, we will punish you. We will punish you financially, and we will list your name. You are required now under NASDAQ to have diverse gender identity, and all forms of diversity, including age and sexual orientation. And when a regulator comes in, it's always worse than what they asked for. And I'm not suggesting this is worse. I'm just saying boards have to self-diversify because this change is afoot. And this is slow to reach North American soil. In Europe and Asia and other countries, it's all quotas. It's 30, 40, 50%, depending on the jurisdiction. So I think that this has been frustrating for female directors and ethnic directors and Francophone directors and Indigenous directors. So So the sooner we get on with this, the better, Craig.
Thank you, Richard. And there are more questions, but we are really running out of time here. Thank you so much, for being on What's Up Wednesday today.
Craig, if there's any question that I can answer downstream, I'm happy to do that because I know there's quite an interest. So I'm happy to address that.
Okay. Well, we will pass these on to you. Okay. And the session's been recorded. We'll be making it available to members and the PowerPoint as well. A few of my takeaways, don't underestimate the need for your own financial literacy as a board member. What happens in the boardroom stays in the boardroom. Ask strategic questions, do background checks. 40% of meetings will continue to be virtual, so get the right equipment and get diversity on your board. Thank you, Dr. Richard Leblanc.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Sandra. Yeah. Thanks, Sandra Addison Brock as well for running this event. Next month, December 8th, What's Up Wednesday, our guest speaker will be Carrie Lysenko. She'll be talking about digital marketing. She will provide tips on how to do a digital health check on yourself, your business. Make sure you've got your digital strategy up to date. Join us December 8th, same time, same channel. Everyone, buy a poppy and God bless. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody. Nice meeting you.